Colleagues, your questions and comments, please. Peter, may I? Okay, I pull back. Haile Mariam, please.
First of all, let me thank Peter for this very illustrative presentation. And it's a music to our ears who came from the developing countries when we have intellectuals like Peter who are fighting for us. Our voices should be heard globally because, the depletion of resources in developing countries is so huge that we need gatherings like this one who can help the process, because Africa as a continent is a young continent which can contribute to the global prosperity, but the situation we are in at this moment is somehow very much worrisome. And thank you for this contribution. My question is, when we are talking about Latin America and Africa in comparison, the African, don't you think that the African biodiversity has not been explored properly? Because we feel that there are many species which are not scientifically documented in Africa, and I think it needs more exploration, more an understanding of what's happening in our continent. So I just want to learn from you on these issues.
Africa, like all parts of the world, including Europe, needs a great deal more exploration. And I love the example of the work at the zoo in Cali that Dominguez gave yesterday, for example, as a sort of thing that can well go on in Africa. And there are a number of things like that going on in Africa. It is, however, true that Africa has been much better explored for plants and vertebrates and butterflies and so forth than either Latin America or Asia. And the increase of species per year in Africa, for instance, of plants, is a tiny fraction of what the increase of species is in Latin America or Asia. Having said that, we know almost nothing about the vast majority of them and need an enormous amount of further exploration and work to learn about them. And of course, we always need to keep in mind that, not counting the bacteria and archaea, there are I think about at least 12 million species of organisms in the world. We've named fewer than 2 million of them, and most groups are entirely unknown. When we can talk about 47 new species of four-eyed flies in traps in the backyards in Los Angeles, we get a good image of the kind of disparity there is between our knowledge of different groups. And it's also true to say that for most organisms, even most vertebrate animals, about all we know is there's a dead one in a bottle of alcohol somewhere in the basement of the Natural History Museum on Cromwell Road, and nothing at all is known about its features. A tiny fraction of the small fraction that have been given Latin names is known in any detail. So yes, there is a very large amount of additional work to be done in Africa and indeed in the Northern Hemisphere, but still Latin America and tropical Asia are even more poorly known.
Well, congratulations, Peter, for a very thoughtful remarks. My question to you is about the communication challenge. You said that we need to capture the societal attention to the biodiversity crisis. And if we look at the climate history, or around the debate about climate change, the message about 1 degree warming, 2 degrees warming has not been enough for societies to mobilize and give priority to face climate change in the US and many other parts of the world. So how would you phrase the message around the biodiversity crisis? Because if we say, well, 1 million species will go extinct, people can just respond, well, there will be still several other million species there, so we're not going to be short of species. So we have to be very thoughtful and very smart on how to message this crisis. How would you approach this?
I wish I knew, and that's why I called on all of you yesterday to give me those magic words. It's very difficult. You know, in the United States, roughly 2/3 of the people of all political parties and all persuasions believe that global warming is a serious problem and that we need to do something about it. The corresponding number for biodiversity would be only a few percent. And when we get to big numbers, that's usually completely stupefying and means nothing to people. When we talk about Sumatran rhinos, it's a small problem, but zoos at least keep, or importantly, I shouldn't say at least, keep illustrating the facts of the situation in their own way. And perhaps even more importantly, they bring us a kind of internationalism on which our future must be based. But I would challenge any of you to give me about 3 magical sentences about why we ought to care about biodiversity, especially about why we ought to care about the loss of individual species. You know, most people think, well, if it's all agriculture, great.
So I think that is possible. But there are a few things that we need to consider. First of all, we at this moment do not have the allies or the tools to sway world opinion. That's not our speciality of knowledge, interest, and training. However, these people are around. They are actually interested to come on board. The people I talk to, they say, yes, we have saved Ferrero from becoming bankrupt, and they are now selling more Nutella, which, as you know, comes from palm oil than ever before. But we can also join in and help you perhaps to save the orangutan instead of saving the company that cuts down indirectly the forest where the orangutan works. So I think if we here decide on clear words, then we have a basis to start talking to people who can set that into a language, into communication strategies that might swing. But a few things we have to consider. One is, we are all still too many disparate voices. We need to learn to speak with one voice, and I think that is what the climate change community has probably achieved. They are talking as one big group with one voice, and you need a lot of time. If you look at how long it took for climate change communication to become mainstream news, it does take a lot of time. So first you need to find a common cause, then you need to have experts on board help you with the communication, and then in 5-10 years' time you might get there. So there's no quick fix. We need to start with ourselves and then find the right allies. That would be my take.
Thank you. Peter, if I may point to a key policy point which you make in your paper on the Convention on Biodiversity. You clearly criticize, and rightly so, that it hasn't worked over the last quarter century. So it needs to be rewritten. The basic philosophy and economics of access and benefit sharing have not facilitated protection and have not facilitated sharing potential benefits. I'm afraid we need to get in conversations as a biodiversity community with the international policy and and legal process in the context of the next year's debates over, in the context of the upcoming Conference of the Parties. Do you have suggestions on broad outlines how a future CBD should look like? It has been declared by many environmentalists as a holy grail, although it has not worked. So I think we have a communication issue there too, and you have in your paper rightly pointed at that. But Peter, do you have suggestions on the way forward, and how would a better CBD look like?
You know, I was a participant in the first few meetings on the building the Convention of Biological Diversity, which were held in Nairobi in the late 80s, and about 20 of us sat around tables and found and really concluded that the most important thing that needed to happen was the transfer of more money, which means more understanding, from rich countries to poor countries. Within a couple of years, the meetings had swollen to 2,000 people, about 90% lawyers, and they all argued about an elaborate system, very poorly based scientifically, to prevent anybody from doing anything. In other words, it's great to talk about benefit sharing, but in a world where the forests are being cut so rapidly, where anybody who has a commercial interest can steal any biodiversity they want, it becomes a very peculiar thing to rule out scientific cooperation, the transfer of specimens, any kind of interchange between countries around the world in the field of biodiversity. To be effective, I think the funding mechanism for the Convention on Biodiversity needs to be greatly increased, and if you look at the amounts involved in the climate change, you can begin to get into the range that we need to talk about. I think we can go on pointing fingers forever at people around the world and erecting barriers to keep people out of the forests as they're being cut, but I don't think that will really do any good. I think we have to still go back to where we were in the 1980s, find ways for mutual cooperation, the transfer of funds, scientific cooperation and training, and things that will really make a difference. A paper that we wrote on the Convention on Biological Diversity is cited in the paper that I gave here. Very well intentioned. And of course, I can't resist saying that what is disheartening to me, although it's true and although we need to do it, is that when I hear Johannes talking about it taking a great time to change opinions, when we have 25% of the tropical forest having been cut in the last 25 years, a great time is very serious, and, as we all know, extinction is forever.
So we are entering already in a broad cross-cutting debate. There are 6 papers in this session before us. I would like to propose we listen to our Chancellor, and then I hand over to you, Peter, to manage this big session. And we make sure that we have cross-cutting debate during the morning and after the coffee break again. Marcelo.
Thank you, but I prefer to ask this question in the general discussion, because in the contrary, we open a new discussion. So.
Please give us a footnote and we start thinking.
Okay. Now, as we say in the meeting about extinction that we organized also with Peter, the solution that proposed the Church for the question of population is a Christian marriage. It's very simple. One man from one woman and one woman from one man. So we have in this way and control, because we need to educate the children, and this is part of the Christian proposal of the Christian marriage, and this is the real solution. When we have And the countries that have this kind of vision, we don't have the problem of the excess of population. So I think that this also is a contribution for climate change.
Okay, thank you, Marcelo. Peter, I suggest you now move on and call on John Clark and the other speakers and manage the session. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you. For the first paper of the session, I'll call on John Clark, the president of the Center for Plant Conservation, a coordinating body for preserving the plants of the United States and Canada. John?